My beloved son. Esther peered out of the window at the garden below. All the colors from the flowers that had recently blossomed looked beautiful. She thought back to her own garden, which was now a distant memory, where she'd be out every day doing something or other. Since coming here, she spent most of her days reading and having the odd conversation with another resident, who was just down the corridor from her. Most of the other residents would either sleep all day or stay in their rooms. At the other end of the building was a social room, where there would be events held, like Zumba dancing to playing games, like cards or Monopoly. Her son Gary only visited once in a blue moon, always saying he was busy. His wife Ruth visited her at least once a week, bringing flowers to brighten up her room. She'd always liked Ruth. Esther turned away from the window and opened a book which sat on her lap. Yesterday, Ruth had brought it in with her, knowing Esther would appreciate it. She'd already read 6 chapters, and it was very enjoyable. She awoke abruptly and heard many voices, observing 3 or 4 carers in the corridor as they rushed past her doorway. What was going on? Her mobility wasn't very good. Usually, one of the carers would assist her, but Esther needed to know what was going on. With trouble, she got out of bed, grabbing her walking stick, then made her way to the entrance. Once in the corridor, she proceeded carefully to a room where the voices could still be heard. At the doorway, the frail woman looked in and saw an elderly man had fallen onto the floor. Blood ran from the wound on his head. The poor soul was unconscious, as the carers did their best to help him. Audrey, one of the carers, noticed Esther, then helped her back to her room, saying there was nothing to worry about. Back in bed, all Esther thought about was the poor fella, hoping he'd be okay. The next morning, Esther was woken up by Gavin, another carer who worked there. "Morning, Esther. I heard you had a busy night last night." Still half asleep, she said, "My God, what's the time?" The man smiled. "It's 10:30, my dear." How was this possible? She was usually up by 7, every morning. "I'm so sorry, Gavin. I didn't mean to wake up so late." He placed a hand softly on her shoulder. "You're forgiven, sweetheart. If you would like, you can stay here a while longer. But I know you love to sit by the window reading your many books." "I better get up. I can't believe I slept in." "Will you help me please, Gavin?" she asked, embarrassed. Because she woke so early, she'd usually dress herself and wait for someone to help her outside, to her beloved chair. Today, for some reason, she felt very tired, but she didn't want to stay here all day like some others did. Once she was dressed, Gavin helped her to her seat by the window. "Thank you," she said. He smiled, then replied, "All my pleasure, Esther. By the way, would you like some breakfast before I get on with other tasks?" "Haven't they finished with breakfast yet?" the woman asked, confused. Gavin laughed. "Well, I'll have to go through management, which can be tricky, but I should imagine they'll be okay with it." "Thank you so much for your kindness," she said, as a tear came to her eye. Her son, who she hardly saw, entered her thoughts. Gavin and her son were a similar age, you see, and Gavin reminded her of him, sometimes. After she'd eaten breakfast, Esther opened the book which sat on her lap, hoping to finish it by this evening. While she read, something began to worry her. The words all of a sudden became blurry, to the point where she had difficulty reading anymore. Without warning, her body started to shake violently. Esther had no control over this. She tried to cry out for someone to help her. Everything then went black. Gary had just got off the phone, chatting to some potential customer, when his mobile on the desk rang. The number that was calling him looked familiar. Then it dawned on him who it was. "Hello, this is Gary. How can I help you?" he said nervously, expecting the worst. Guilt was also felt, knowing he hadn't visited recently. The drive to the care home was the worst he'd ever known. He went through an array of emotions. But the one that stood out was of him not being there for her when she needed it the most. The reason he didn't visit that often was because he hated seeing her as a frail old woman who needed looking after and was no longer the strong-willed independent woman he once remembered. Gary walked through the entrance and into the reception, where a woman sat at a desk. Once he'd explained why he was there, she called someone, and within a minute, a man appeared, to tell him what had happened. He held his mum's hand while she lay in the bed, asleep. From what the carer had said, she'd had a seizure, which meant in time, there might be more. The local doctor had been notified, and would come in tomorrow to check on her. Esther opened her eyes and the first thing she saw was her beautiful grown-up son. "Is that really you?" she said emotionally. He bent down and kissed her forehead tenderly. "I was so scared, Mum, that I'd lost you." There, don't be sad," she answered. "I feel so tired. Why am I still in bed?" Gary wiped his eyes with a tissue, then said, "I'm so sorry for not being here more often." Every time she saw him, the person she'd known since he was a tiny baby, her world would be complete, but the last thing she wanted was to make him unhappy. Esther knew how he felt about these sorts of places, seeing her as she now was. She loved him too much to want to upset him and said, "Don't feel bad, Gary. You have nothing to be sorry for. You have your own life. Don't worry about silly old me." He looked at her sadly, then answered, "I promise you, Mum, things are going to change. This is not about me anymore, it's about you. I've been so selfish and afraid of what might be, that I never realized until today, how much I love you, and I'm never going to abandon you again." Both cried. The next morning, the doctor checked her and everything was normal, much to Esther's relief. She still didn't feel right and took things easy for a little while. Gary visited 2 or 3 times most weeks, apart from when he was away with work. Ruth, his wife, still came in regularly, always with a bunch of colorful flowers. Even the carers noticed how much happier she seemed, and every day, she would sit in her chair by the window, reading her most cherished books and looking at the beautiful flowers only a short distance away. For a little while, Gary and Ruth had been planning a nice surprise for Mum, but they still had a lot of work to do. On Christmas Day, the care home gave them permission to take Esther home for a few hours, where she could enjoy proper family time and a lovely meal cooked by Ruth, but it didn't stop there. One Saturday in May, they had a day trip out, where Gary and Ruth both took turns in pushing her around in a wheelchair. By all accounts, Esther had a wonderful time, because when she got back to the care home, she'd tell everyone all about it. Gary realized his mum's biggest regret was losing her beloved garden, that she looked after religiously, until it became too much. Shortly after this, she went into a care home. For the last few months, Gary and his wife had been working on their own garden, so it looked similar to his mum's from years ago. Esther looked up at Gary, a little startled. "What do you mean, my lovely? Where are we going?" "As I haven't got myself ready," she asked. "Where we are going, you don't need to get ready, because you'll be spending this afternoon sitting in our garden drinking a nice cup of tea," he answered. "Well, if you put it like that, it sounds lovely," she said, pleased. He parked the car in the drive and got out, then helped his mum into the wheelchair. "What lovely weather," she said. "It's an absolutely glorious day, Mum. Too nice to be stuck indoors, wouldn't you agree?" She looked up at him and smiled. "Yes, I agree." "Are you ready?" he said. "Yes, darling." Gary pushed her through the gate and into the back garden, where all the flowers had blossomed and looked beautiful. Ruth saw Gary and Esther from the kitchen window and joined them. Esther looked at the flowers in awe. "This place reminds me of my own garden. It's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much," she cried happily. "If this was the last thing I see, then I'd be happy." Gary and Ruth were overjoyed. In the middle of the garden was a table where they could sit. For a little while, they drank tea and laughed aplenty. By 5 o'clock, Gary drove her back to the care home and stayed with her until she went to bed. "I love you, son. I had a lovely day today," she said emotionally. "I love you as well, Mum. Sleep tight, if not the bedbugs will bite," he replied. "And I'll see you in a couple of days, I promise." He kissed the top of her head. "That sounds wonderful, darling," she answered softly. She watched him as he left the room, then closed her eyes. And that night she had the most lovely dreams. The end.